All right, let's dive into one of history's greatest and kind of weirdest paradoxes. We're talking about the story of how an institution that was literally founded on vows of poverty somehow became the single biggest landowner and economic power in all of Europe. Yeah, this is the story of the Church's Holy Vault.
So how in the world did that happen? I mean, how did the medieval church manage to turn its spiritual authority into a full-blown material empire that could go toe-to-toe with kings? Well, the answer, and this might surprise you, actually starts with the fall of Rome.
Okay, so here's our game plan. We're going to break this whole thing down into 5 parts. We'll kick things off with the legal ghost of the Roman Empire, then see how ownership got a holy makeover. After that, we'll look at the economic engine that built all that wealth, get a sense of the sheer scale of its power, and finally, we'll cover the massive backlash that came next.
So, our story doesn't really start with a birth. It starts with a death. I'm talking about the collapse of the Western Roman Empire back in the 5th century. And as the whole state just crumbled, it left this enormous power vacuum. But here's the thing, one really crucial part of the empire didn't fall apart, and that was its incredibly sophisticated legal framework. And right at the heart of that legal system was this incredibly important concept, dominium. Now, this wasn't just about, being able to use a piece of land. No, this was the idea of absolute, total, rightful ownership. It was the power to control it, to sell it, to do whatever you wanted with it. And even though the emperors were long gone, this powerful idea, it found a new home.
And that, right there, is where the church stepped in. It basically became the new custodian of Roman law, carefully preserving all these ancient texts in its monasteries and universities. It picked up the legal tools that Rome had left lying around and, well, it started using them. And just like that, bishops started becoming landlords, monasteries turned into massive estates, and the church began weaving these Roman legal concepts into its own super powerful internal legal system. We know it as canon law, and it would end up governing pretty much everything, from who you could marry to who owned what, all across Christendom.
But here's the really clever part. The church didn't just copy and paste Roman law. It did something way more revolutionary. It took this purely secular idea of property and gave it a divine justification. This is the moment where law and theology fused together to create something brand new and incredibly powerful.
Now, of course, this whole process didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual thing. First, you had thinkers like Augustine, who basically argued that, hey, in a fallen, sinful world, private property is kind of a necessary evil. But then, centuries later, you get Thomas Aquinas, and he takes it a huge step further. He frames private property as a totally rational, natural development. And the end result? A complete transformation. Owning land was no longer just some legal right. It was now a reflection of a divinely ordained natural order.
And that was the final piece of the puzzle. The church had pulled it off. It had successfully sanctified the idea of ownership. To possess land was no longer just a right granted by some earthly law, it was a sign of moral order, a sign of divine favor. And let me tell you, this powerful ideological foundation was absolutely crucial for everything that was about to happen next.
Okay, so with the idea of ownership now divinely sanctioned, the church had the green light to build a powerful and, more importantly, a systematic economic engine, one designed to accumulate wealth on a scale that nobody had ever seen before.
And look, this wasn't about a few random donations here and there. Oh no. This was a sophisticated, multifaceted system. You had the tithe, which was basically a universal tax. You had the super controversial sale of indulgences, pardons for sin, for a price. You had these massive tax-exempt farming operations run by monasteries. You had the flat-out confiscation of land from anyone they labeled a heretic. And yet, even the plunder from the Crusades. Every single one of these was a powerful stream of revenue, all flowing right into the church's vaults.
Let's talk about the tithe, because it was really the bedrock of this whole system. I want you to just imagine a 10% tax on literally everything produced. We're talking from the grain in the field to a brand new calf being born. This single tax institutionalized the church's right to a slice of the entire European economy. It created this steady, incredibly reliable flow of absolutely immense wealth. Then you've got the sale of indulgences. The sales pitch was pretty simple. Give money to the church, and you could shorten your time or a loved one's time in purgatory. I mean, salvation, which was once offered freely, basically became a system of spiritual taxation. It was a practice that literally converted spiritual authority directly into cold, hard cash. And here's another one of those great paradoxes. The monasteries. Think about it. Individual monks, they all took personal vows of poverty.
But the institutions they belonged to, they became these gigantic economic engines. We're talking about tax-exempt landlords running huge farms, vineyards, mills, you name it. They weren't just quiet places of prayer. They were some of the most powerful centers of production and territorial control in Europe.
The church also wasn't afraid to expand its holdings through brute force. See, declaring a group heretical wasn't just a spiritual judgment call. It was a fantastic economic opportunity. Take the Albigensian Crusade against the Cathars in France, for example. It led to the systematic confiscation of all their lands, which were then just absorbed right into the church's domain. Religious doctrine became a brutally effective tool for asset transfer.
So, what happens when this holy economic engine runs at full steam for centuries? Well, the result is that the church became, and I am not exaggerating here, the single greatest landlord in all Europe. Honestly, the sheer scale of its landholdings is kind of difficult for us to even wrap our heads around today.
Just look at that number, 40%. In a country like France, at the absolute peak of its power, the church controlled nearly 40% of all productive farmland. And we're not talking about useless swampland here. This was the best, most valuable land in the kingdom. That meant millions of peasants were effectively working for the church. Even kings had to come to the table and negotiate with this ecclesiastical superpower. It's a level of economic dominance that is just, wow, almost unimaginable today.
And it wasn't just France, not by a long shot. The situation was pretty similar all across Europe. Over in England, before the Reformation kicked off, the church held somewhere between a quarter and a third of all the land. Just stop and think about the political power that comes with that kind of ownership. In a lot of these kingdoms, the church owned more land than the king and all the noble families combined. It effectively made the church a state within a state, and often one that was completely above the law of the monarch.
So if there's one crucial takeaway, it's this. The spiritual authority of the church had been systematically and brilliantly converted into physical control over the European landscape. The power over people's souls had become power over the very soil under their feet.
But as you can probably guess, this incredible concentration of wealth and power just couldn't last forever. It was bound to create a backlash. And when it came, it was a backlash that would splinter Western Christianity and completely reshape the map of Europe for good. You can really point to two key moments that signaled the beginning of the end. First, in 1517, you have Martin Luther nailing his 95 Theses to a church door. And it is no accident that his very first line of attack was the sale of indulgences, that blatant link between money and salvation. Then, a little later, in 1536, you get England's King Henry VIII. He didn't just break with the Pope on a spiritual level, he launched the dissolution of the monasteries, seizing every last bit of the church's land in what was probably the single biggest transfer of wealth in English history, all going straight to the crown.
And that really gets to the heart of it. The Protestant Reformation was never just a theological dispute about faith and Scripture. It was absolutely an economic and political revolution. It was a revolt against that very fusion of spiritual authority and massive material wealth that we've been talking about this whole time.
Which, it leaves us with a pretty big final question. Today, we take the idea of separating church and state as a bedrock principle in a lot of countries. But that idea didn't just pop out of nowhere. It's a direct, historical response to the 1,000-year story we've just walked through. A time when the church wasn't just a spiritual guide, but was also the ultimate landlord. It's a legacy that, whether we realize it or not, continues to shape the world we live in right now.